The rain in the spring of 1862 did not just fall, it devoured the earth. It turned the Virginia Peninsula into a suffocating lime-yellow bog of mud that swallowed wagon wheels, rotted the leather boots off marching men, and bred a stagnant, low-lying mist that smelled heavily of sulfur, wet wool, and impending mortality. Through this primordial soup of the American Civil War marched the 3rd Vermont Volunteer Infantry. They were a regiment of giants, hefty lumbermen, rugged stonecutters, and stoic farmers from the Green Mountains, men built to fell timber and withstand the brutal northern winters. But tucked near the center of this grim column, struggling to keep his short stride in rhythm with the long, rhythmic sloshes of the grown men around him, was a boy who looked like he had been stolen from a schoolhouse. His name was Willie Johnston. He was 11 years old.
He did not carry a Springfield rifle. He did not wear a heavy cartridge box at his hip. Instead, slung across his narrow, boyish shoulder by a faded leather strap was a heavy wooden snare drum, its calfskin head tightened against the dampness, its shell scratched and scarred by the rough realities of military life. Willie stood barely 4 feet tall. The wool uniform coat issued to him by the state of Vermont, even after being drastically cut down by a sympathetic company tailor, still bunched heavily at his waist and threatened to swallow his small hands within its brass-buttoned sleeves. To the casual observer, he was a mascot, a tragic novelty of a war that was rapidly losing its romantic veneer. To the men of Company D, he was their heartbeat. And to the pages of human history, this child was about to perform a feat of sheer, obstinate endurance that would make him the youngest individual ever to receive the United States Medal of Honor, a record that stands unbroken to this very day.
To understand how an 11-year-old child found himself marching into the meat grinder of the Peninsula Campaign, one must understand the fever that gripped the American landscape in the fateful summer of 1861. When the Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter in April of that year, the nation tore itself apart at the seams. In the towns and villages of Vermont, the call to preserve the Union was met with a religious fervor. Public squares became recruitment hubs overnight. Men lined up by the hundreds to swear their allegiances, driven by patriotism, adventure, and the widespread, naive belief that the conflict would be resolved in a single glorious afternoon. In the small town of Salem, New York, just across the Vermont border, a house painter named Willie Johnston answered the call. He was a mature man, a father, but the pull of the Union cause was irresistible. However, Willie Johnston did not go to the recruitment station alone. Tugging at his coat was his young son, Willie.
Willie's mother had passed away, leaving the bond between father and son unbreakable. When Willie Johnston signed his name to the enlistment rolls of the 3rd Vermont Infantry, Willie stood beside him, weeping and demanding to go along. In the early days of the war, the military structure was highly localized and remarkably informal. Regimental commanders often looked the other way when it came to regulations, if it meant filling their quotas or maintaining morale. A young boy who knew how to strike a drum could be useful. The drum was not a toy. It was the battlefield communication system of the 19th century. In an era before radio communication, tactical earpieces, or satellite drops, the voice of a commander was easily drowned out by the deafening roar of black powder musketry and the concussive boom of smoothbore artillery. It was the drummer boy who transmitted orders across the chaotic, smoke-blinded fields. A specific cadence meant advance. Another meant retreat. Others signaled sidestep to the left, fix bayonets, or fire by platoon. The drummer was the nervous system of the regiment.
On December 11th, 1861, despite his tender age, Willie Johnston was officially mustered into the service of the United States as a musician in Company D of the 3rd Vermont Infantry. He was promised the standard musician's pay of $13 a month. For the first few months, the war was an extended, grueling camp game. The 3rd Vermont was stationed in the defenses of Washington, D.C., training at Camp Griffin. Here, Willie learned the complex, rigorous rudiments of military drumming. He practiced the double drag, the paradiddle, and the flam until his small fingers were calloused and bloody. The older soldiers treated him with a mixture of amusement and paternal protectiveness. They shared their rations of hardtack with him, helped him clean his mud-caked boots, and amused themselves by watching the tiny soldiers salute officers with absolute rigid gravity.
But the playful prelude of Camp Griffin evaporated in the spring of 1862 when Major General George B. McClellan launched his massive Peninsula Campaign. The objective was bold: transport the massive Army of the Potomac by water to the Virginia Peninsula and march up the land between the York and James Rivers to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, effectively ending the rebellion in one decisive stroke. When the 3rd Vermont loaded onto the transports, Willie Johnston was right there with them, his drums safely cased in oilcloth.
The reality of war set in almost immediately upon landing. The Virginia Peninsula was a natural fortress of swamps, dense pine forests, and fortified Confederate defensive lines. The spring rains turned the primitive dirt roads into bottomless mires of red and yellow clay. Men marched until their knees buckled, their backs aching under the weight of 60-pound packs. For Willie, the march was a daily torment. Every stride taken by a grown man required 2 or 3 rapid, scrambling steps from his short legs. The heavy wooden drum bounced rhythmically against his thigh, leaving deep purple bruises through his thin trousers. Yet, according to accounts from the men of his company, the boy refused to complain. While older, stronger men collapsed by the roadside from sheer exhaustion, throwing away their gear in desperation, Willie kept his eyes locked on his father's broad back ahead of him and kept marching.
The regiment tasted its first major blood in mid-April at the Battle of Lee's Mill. It was a chaotic, poorly managed affair where the Union troops were ordered to cross a deep, flooded creek under the direct fire of well-entrenched Confederate forces. The water rose up to the chests of the grown men. For Willie, it would have been a drowning pool. Ordered to stay in the rear, the young boy watched in horror as the wounded and dying were carried back across the muddy banks. The screams of the men, the terrifying roar of the artillery, and the sharp, metallic tang of burning gunpowder in the damp air were his true initiation into the horrors of the American Civil War. The romantic illusions of Camp Griffin were dead. The war was a monster, and it was hungry. By late June, McClellan's massive army had crept within sight of the church spires of Richmond. The end of the war seemed tantalizingly close. But the Confederate command had changed. General Robert E. Lee had assumed control of the Army of Northern Virginia, and Lee was not a man to wait to be besieged. On June 25th, 1862, Lee launched a ferocious, sustained counteroffensive that would become known to history as the 7 Days Battles. What followed was a week of sheer, unadulterated hell. Lee struck the Union flanks with a savagery that stunned McClellan. The Union commander, gripped by panic and convinced he was vastly outnumbered, ordered a general retreat. It was not a strategic, orderly withdrawal. It was a desperate, exhausting race for survival. The Army of the Potomac was forced to abandon its positions and fight its way south toward the safety of the James River, where Union gunboats could offer protection. The retreat was a nightmare of biblical proportions. The temperatures soared into the high 90s, accompanied by suffocating Virginia humidity. The roads were clogged with thousands of panicked men, ammunition wagons, artillery caissons, and herds of beef cattle. To make matters worse, Lee's forces pursued them relentlessly, striking at the Union rearguard at every opportunity. The 3rd Vermont was placed right in the thick of this chaotic withdrawal, tasked with holding the line so the rest of the army could escape. As the days bled together into a continuous blur of marching and fighting, the heat and exhaustion took a devastating toll. The Union retreat rapidly deteriorated into an every-man-for-himself scramble. Soldiers, driven mad by thirst and fatigue,
began discarding everything that weighed them down. The sides of the roads became littered with millions of dollars of government property. Thousands of expensive Springfield rifles were tossed into ditches. Heavy wool blankets, overcoats, knapsacks, cooking utensils, and cartridge boxes were abandoned in massive heaps.
Among the items most frequently discarded by the fleeing army were the musical instruments. To a grown man running for his life in 95-degree heat, a bulky, awkward drum or a heavy brass horn was nothing more than a death sentence. Throughout the ranks of the Army of the Potomac, dozens of drummer boys, some older and stronger than Willie, cast their drums into the mud and ran, terrified and empty-handed, to keep up with the retreat. But not Willie Johnston. On the brutal march from Savage's Station to White Oak Swamp, the 3rd Vermont was subjected to a grueling artillery bombardment while struggling through a narrow, choked bottleneck. The air was thick with flying splinters, deadly shrapnel, and the terrifying screams of mutilated horses. Men were panicking. The heat was oppressive, draining the last remnants of human will. Willie's father, Union Johnston, looked back through the smoke, desperate to ensure his son was still alive.
There was Willie. His small face was blackened by soot and sweat, his uniform torn, his lips cracked from lack of water. The heavy drum strap was cutting deeply into his shoulder, raw and bleeding from the constant friction. His father, seeing the boy staggering under the weight, explicitly told him to throw the drum into the swamp to save his own life. Willie looked at his father, his eyes fierce with an obstinate, childlike pride. He refused. To Willie, that drum was not a burden. It was his duty. It was the voice of Company D. If he threw it away, he was no longer a soldier. He was just a helpless child lost in a wasteland of slaughter. He adjusted the leather strap on his raw shoulder, gripped the wooden rims with his blistered hands to keep it from swinging, and kept his feet moving forward through the deep, sucking mire. While men 3 times his size collapsed and abandoned their weapons, the 11-year-old boy clung to his instrument with a grip of pure iron. Through the horrors of Charles City Crossroads and the bloody, desperate stand at Malvern Hill, where the Union artillery tore the advancing Confederate ranks to pieces, Willie Johnston carried his drum. He slept on the wet ground with his arms wrapped around the wooden shell to protect the delicate calfskin head from the dampness. He went without food, he bled, he wept in silence, but he never let go. On July 2, 1862, the battered, bleeding remnants of the Army of the Potomac finally staggered into Harrison's Landing on the James River. They were safe under the heavy guns of the Federal ironclads, but they were a broken, demoralized force. The brilliant campaign to capture Richmond had ended in a catastrophic, humiliating retreat. The next morning, Major General McClellan rode out to review the troops. He wanted to assess the condition of his army, to see what could be salvaged from the disaster. He ordered a parade of the regiments. It was a dismal spectacle. The men stood in ragged, mud-soaked formations, their uniforms in tatters, many without hats, boots, or equipment. When the 3rd Vermont was ordered to form up, the commanding officers looked for musicians to play the regiment into position. A grim, embarrassing silence fell over the division. Throughout the entire brigade, virtually every single drummer boy had thrown his drum away during the terrifying retreat through the swamps. There was no music to grease the wheels of military pride. Then, a sharp, rhythmic sound broke the melancholy silence of the camp. Roll-tap, roll-tap, rat-a-tat-tat. From the ranks of Company D stepped Willie Johnston. He had cleaned the mud off his uniform as best he could, his face was washed, and there, slung perfectly over his shoulder, was his drum, its wooden shell scratched but fully intact, its drumheads tight and clear. He was the only drummer boy in the entire brigade who had brought his instrument through the hell of the 7 days' battles. With absolute, unyielding discipline, the 11-year-old boy stood alone before the remnants of his regiment and began to beat the assembly cadence. His small hands moved with crisp, flawless precision. The sound of that solitary drum echoed across the dreary flats of Harrison's Landing. It was a profound, electrifying moment. To the weary, disheartened soldiers who had just witnessed the near destruction of their army, the sound of that boy's drum was not just music, it was a defiant statement that they had survived, that they were still a regiment, and that their spirit had not been conquered.
General McClellan himself stopped his horse. He looked down at the tiny, defiant figure beating the drum with such fierce intensity. The general was deeply moved. He turned to the regimental commanders and inquired about the boy. When told that Willie had carried the instrument through every mile of the brutal, panic-stricken retreat, despite his father's own suggestion to discard it, McClellan was astonished. The story of the indomitable little drummer boy of the 3rd Vermont spread like wildfire through the camps and eventually made its way north, appearing in newspaper accounts. In a war that had grown increasingly grim, bloody, and devoid of romance, the public hungered for heroes. They found one in an 11-year-old child from the Green Mountains. The war, however, did not stop for heroes. The 3rd Vermont was quickly swept back into the vortex of the conflict. Willie continued to serve, his drum continuing to sound the commands through some of the bloodiest engagements of the Eastern Theater. He was there at the titanic Battle of Antietam in September 1862, where the creeks literally ran red with American blood. He witnessed the horrific, frozen slaughterhouse of Fredericksburg in December, where Union waves were ruthlessly mowed down before Marie's Heights. Through it all, the boy remained a steady, reliable presence, his drumbeat a comforting constant for the shrinking numbers of the original 3rd Vermont. Word of Willie's incredible exploit at Harrison's Landing eventually reached the highest echelons of the United States government. It caught the attention of a man who was carrying the immense, crushing weight of a fractured nation on his shoulders, President Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln, a man known for his deep empathy and his profound affection for ordinary soldiers, was deeply touched by the story of the young boy who refused to surrender his duty when grown men were abandoning theirs. The Medal of Honor had been newly created by Congress in 1862 to honor soldiers who distinguished themselves by their gallantry in action and other soldier-like qualities. It was the nation's highest military decoration, an honor intended for daring feats of combat valor. But Lincoln understood that valor took many forms. It was found not only in the pulling of a trigger or the storming of an enemy parapet. It was also found in the stubborn, unyielding discipline of a child who maintained the heartbeat of his regiment when all around him was collapsing into chaos. On the recommendation of the Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, and with the enthusiastic endorsement of President Lincoln, Willie Johnston was awarded the Medal of Honor.
The official presentation took place on September 16, 1863. Willie was just 12 years old. He traveled to Washington, D.C., a city buzzing with military activity, and entered the War Department. There, Secretary of War Stanton personally pinned the heavy bronze star to the breast of the boy's oversized uniform coat. The citation was brief, elegant, and permanent. For gallantry on the Peninsula Campaign, 1862. Think about the sheer historical magnitude of that moment. A 12-year-old child standing in the heart of the American war machine, receiving the highest military honor his nation could possibly bestow. He had not killed an enemy. He had not captured a flag. He had done something far more difficult. He had preserved his honor, his duty, and his instrument in the face of absolute terror and physical exhaustion. Following the presentation of his medal, Willie's story took an even more fascinating turn. Recognizing the immense public relations value of the young hero, the government transferred Willie to the newly formed Invalid Corps, later renamed the Veteran Reserve Corps. This was a unit composed of partially disabled or honorable veterans who could no longer serve on the front lines, but could perform guard duties, clerical work, and ceremonial functions.
Willie was assigned to a unit in Washington, D.C., where he became a prominent fixture at military parades, recruitment drives, and state functions. He even performed for President Lincoln at the White House on multiple occasions. The image of the tiny, medal-wearing drummer boy became a powerful symbol of the Union's youth, resilience, and unyielding determination to see the conflict through to the bitter end.
Yet, despite his sudden fame, Willie remained a humble soldier. When the war finally drew to its bloody, agonizing conclusion in the spring of 1865, Willie Johnston, now a seasoned 14-year-old veteran of some of the most brutal campaigns in American history, was honorably discharged from the United States Army. He returned to civilian life, a boy who had seen more of death, suffering, and ultimate glory than most men could experience in 3 lifetimes. But as the smoke of the Civil War cleared and the nation began the long, painful process of healing and reconstruction, the historical record regarding Willie Johnston began to grow faint.
Like so many veterans of that titanic struggle, Willie sought to put the horrors of the past behind him. He moved into the vast expanse of a rapidly expanding America. For decades, his ultimate fate remained a profound, frustrating mystery to historians. Some records suggested he moved to Charlestown, Massachusetts. Others hinted he became a mechanic, married, and raised a family in relative obscurity, never boasting of the bronze medal that sat in his drawer. Because the early administration of the Medal of Honor was often poorly documented, and because William Johnston was a remarkably common name, the trail of the youngest recipient grew cold. He seemed to vanish into the ocean of ordinary citizens who built post-war America. Even the location of his final resting place remains unknown to this day, a silent casualty of time. He lies somewhere in an unmarked grave, his dust mingled with the American soil he marched so hard to preserve.
But while the physical man slipped away into the shadows of history, his legacy remains cast in immortal bronze. Today, if you visit the state of Vermont, or if you walk through the hallowed halls of the Pentagon, where the names of all Medal of Honor recipients are etched in stone, you will find the name of Willie Johnston. His story is a staggering reminder of the profound, often tragic burdens placed upon the youth of America during its darkest hour. It challenges our conventional understanding of heroism. Willie Johnston didn't carry a weapon to change the course of history. He carried a drum. He proved that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not to strike down an enemy, but to simply refuse to give up, to keep your feet moving forward when the world around you is falling apart, and to hold on to your duty with a grip that even the fires of hell cannot loosen. He remains forever the little drummer boy of the Union, the youngest hero a grateful nation has ever known.